Thank you for joining us for another episode of Channel Revelations. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan, and we'll be spending the next 2 hours talking about ancient civilizations with the guides and wisdom we can apply to our modern-day lives. As always, Micheila is a trans channel, and I don't discuss any of the questions or topics with her beforehand. We'll be speaking directly to the guides, but just so her conscious mind doesn't interfere in any way with the information, I don't share any of the topics with her beforehand. So we can start whenever you're ready.
All right.
Who are we speaking today?
There are a great many who gather for these interactions, and we are always prepared to invite in those that are best suited to provide answers that are necessary to lead the understanding in the most grounded way. At the same time, we also want to identify that we are Pleiadian, and we are also in connection with the Elohim, a collective of ascended masters.
Okay, so Pleiadians, any particular dimensional Pleiadians or a number of different kinds?
We consider ourselves elders. We are ninth dimensional. However, we have also been in contact with 12th dimensional Pleiadians from time to time throughout these transmissions and are able to access that Akashic information if necessary.
Okay, so I'd like to start by speaking with the Elohim since they are here, because there's some discrepancy in many ancient texts as to who the Elohim are. A lot of different ideas and opinions. Some seem to suggest that Elohim are a collective of very highly conscious beings. But there are also some ancient texts that suggest that the Elohim are the grouping of the top echelon of the Annunaki who came to Earth in ancient times, the ones we discussed, the Enlil-Enki timeline. So can you shed more light on who the Elohim are and what is this relationship that some people attribute to the Anunnaki?
Well, first it is necessary for us to distinguish between a more cosmic relationship to the Elohim and one that is earthly, because often you are referring to an earthly definition of who the Elohim must be, yet this lineage spans all space and time. It is not just those of us who have been present in physical bodies in human form that make up this collective. In fact, if we were to go back to our origins, we would say before many of the planets and star systems that you know today were actually formed in this universe, the prime creator itself expanded into fragments of itself. And we are the manifestation of those first fragments of light that became conscious, and in doing so began to explore the universe to better understand its workings. Beyond that, we have manifested as planets and as stars. But the origins of the Elohim have taken different shapes and forms, as you can imagine. If we are cosmic beings and we have assumed positions in the very beginning of a planet's formation, we may be Anunnaki elders, as well as intergalactic elders of many other different races. Yet, here on planet Earth, we want to make you very aware of the distinguishing line between what you speak of in terms of the Anunnaki and the Elohim that are here to serve, because it would be natural for a cosmic race that has come to Earth to assume some lineage of priority or even royalty, we might say, especially a race that was attempting to sway the minds of those present within the human collective. So there are many stories left behind of Anunnaki who may have claimed this lineage simply because they knew it would work to their advantage in terms of being perceived in a certain light of wisdom or gifts and abilities. But we prefer to perceive the earthly Elohim collective more so as an assembly of ascended masters. Now, this term is a very wide definition as well. Of course, we've spoken of what we see an ascended master to be, which is ultimately an intergalactic being able to manifest in multiple dimensions simultaneously in order to share some level of Akashic relevance. And certainly we see the Elohim this way, a group of intergalactic ascended masters who assumed positions in various timelines throughout ancient history, where they may have been revered as light masters or light teachers. And even today, this collective continues to grow and expand. So based upon Earth's history and all that has happened, ascended masters have risen to the occasion of becoming one with the Elohim for the sake of the Earth's future ascension trajectory.
Is this particular group of Elohim operating from a particular dimension or a variety of different dimensions?
We could not claim one dimension. We are interdimensional, so it is most important to identify us with the 12th dimension, yet at the same time to understand that an ascended master is named as such because within a single incarnation became an aspect of God renewed, meaning there was no distinction between the form that it took and what prime creator assumes itself to be. This realization is something that you are all attempting to attain here on a physical planet in your own unique form. Yes, we would consider ourselves multidimensional, and we must be in order to serve as widely as we do.
Now, the word El, El, is used in ancient times, and even modern times, actually, in particular in the Mesopotamian area where we've discussed Enlil being based as his group of people. And even to this day, a lot of the cities in that area have El in the name, like Tel Aviv, for example. Now, the ancient attribution of this usage was to the Annunaki, who originated in that area, and the El was essentially to this day means God. So is this attribution that was used in Mesopotamian times referring to the Anunnaki gods in physical form on Earth, or was it referring to the Elohim that I'm speaking with today?
Again, this we believe is the perfect scenario and distinction that must be made. Are you referring to Prime Creator as the universal one source of light and energy, or are you using this terminology in order to reference the self as a God? And while there are many who would assume that God is within each one of us and we should all be an aspect of it, those that were present on the planet during the period of Mesopotamia would have wanted to claim this power only for themselves, not for the masses to understand that the power actually would lie within them. So this again is a interesting relationship, we believe, that can be extended to many of your religious teachings, where you are looking at various religions that are teaching of a God outside of the self that should be honored and prayed to, versus coming to a relationship with the primal God within.
Do the Elohim, just like the Pleiadians or the Arcturians and other collectives, have any, or even the Sirians, for example, they all seem to have certain physical or energetic characteristics? For example, the reptilians tend to take a snake-like form or a reptilian kind of form. Do the Elohim have any distinctive proper or characteristics?
It would be a different distinguishing characteristic based upon the individual ascended master that perhaps was representing the Elohim as a collective. So as we speak to you today, we are using the mode of this channel's voice as a one expression, meaning We are combining all of our information, wisdom, and voices to manifest in a very concise format. So it would be difficult for us to say that there could ever be one form that would represent truly the Elohim collective. Yet, if you go back through many of the ancient civilizations where the Elohim may have been revered or spoken of or even experienced, you will see them translated through the individuals that were present at the time. And this is merely a perception. In other words, very similar to what you would experience today if an angel showed up here in your space. Each individual would have a very different definition or vision or experience of what an angelic being may be perceived as, and it isn't always human. Even though the angels are often associated with a more grounded human type of presentation, angels can take many, many different forms, and the Elohim are the same.
With regard to ancient texts, would it be reasonable to say that when the Elohim are referenced in texts such as the Bible, let's say, that it is referring to a physical incarnation, perhaps the Annunaki, that we discussed a moment ago, versus the Elohim that I'm speaking with today?
Yes, we believe that to be true in most cases.
Were the Elohim, the collective that I'm speaking with today, not the Anunnaki version, were that group of Elohim present in the original seeding of humanity on Earth?
Yes, many of us were present during that time. In fact, we had a very specific role and assignment in humanity's original seeding, and it had less to do with the shape, form, and divine plan of the human collective, and truly more to do with the relationship that the collective would hold to Prime Creator. You speak very often of the source field or manifesting through a field known as source. And if we are some of the original God sparks, we have a very significant understanding of how energy is exchanged throughout the universe, and especially how the mechanism of source manifests itself in different dimensions and through different vibrations. It was our assignment to come and study and observe how source energy would flow to a physical material planet and how a new race of humans would adapt to understanding their energetic relationship to it. And we were teachers in this respect, meaning some of the original tribes of humans that were hybrid at first came to understand not necessarily a manifestation technique through us, but the workings of universal law and how they would interface with their own beliefs and who they considered themselves to be. We consider ourselves guides and mentors in this area.
I'd like to go back now and resume where we started the last two times and go back to ancient times and a lot of the ancient architecture that exists around the world. And this time begin with, now in Africa, as we've discussed in previous conversations, Enki was given dominion over Africa. And so the Egyptian civilization and a lot of the African civilization appears to have spawned from his influence or others who were in his group of people or descendants, for example. And in South Africa, in particular, we see certain kind of structures that appear to be stone structures, and they're very weathered or perhaps even were destroyed in a cataclysm. And so not much remains of them now, although they appear to have been made from very small, flat stones that were stacked on top of each other. But they, in their present form, they look very crude, and yet they also embody perfect geometry. And now many conventional archaeologists have attributed them to be housings for cattle. But the thing is, there's no opening and to get into these. So no doorway or entry points, and there are concentric circles on the inside of these structures that also are very small, too small for a room for a human being to live in, and they also don't have doorways or openings. So the idea of them being for cattle or even human beings doesn't make a lot of sense. And secondly, there are at least 100,000 to 10 million of these structures in South Africa. So that's quite a substantial number. So a lot of people have their own speculations on what these structures are and what they were used for, and even whether they were built by the Annunaki. Another theory is that the Enki, essentially his responsibility was to mine for gold, and in the locations where all of these structures are located, there are a lot of ancient gold mines that still remain. And some theories are that these round stone circle structures were used in a way to refine the gold. Can you explain what these structures were and whether it was the Anunnaki or somebody else who built them?
Well, we want to begin by saying that the influence of the Anunnaki is very obvious and present here, not in the structure itself in the way that it appears from the outside, but the technological advancement of what is going on internally, which is extremely important. And when you speak of gold, we want to refer to the idea of power and generating power using inner earth elements. We see these more as free energy devices that we're tapping into the elements and transposing them into either telecommunication centers that would connect to each other, such that regardless of where you were throughout that geographic region, you would be able to receive a message or a signal telepathically. In addition to this, the energy generated between these various points created a field, and that field was very similar to some of the technologies that were used in Atlantis. Remember, in Atlantis, the technologies were working with precious earthly elements to uphold a certain level of coherence and higher vibration. This kept the entire civilization operating in higher consciousness and also holding a unified field, meaning there were more humans operating for the benefit of each other as opposed to themselves. And this is an iteration of this, simply being shown in a different geographic region and using a different format more applicable to that region itself. Now, you're asking about the refinement of gold, and we cannot neglect that in the process of creating these, one of the effects was finding the gold in a supercharged state. So if we're generating power or energy using inner earth elements and precious metals like gold, what is going to happen is the elements or the gold itself is going to become modified through the process. It is somewhat like creating a turbine. When we're using the energy in the inner container of that turbine, we're making efficient use of all of it such that the turbine becomes a self-generating force. And that's ultimately what was taking place within each of these individual units. So the benefits were multiple. We cannot say, of course, that all of it worked out exactly the way it was supposed to. Very much like today, you are in a period of technological advancement where some things are succeeding and other things are failing, and some have advantages and also disadvantages. And of course, this was also the experience of the ancients at this time when they were using these various tools and technologies and putting them in place on a planet that was foreign to where they had come from. All of it had to be observed and measured and further understood. So consider it still, even today, in the format that it has been left behind, not in completion, but a work in progress.
Now, some researchers have speculated the design of these stone circles, inside circles, resembles very closely the electronic component of a magnetron, which we use in laser and microwave transmitters today. Is that what you're referring to? It was something like a magnetron?
We see the similarity here, and we do agree that its design can be considered very closely connected to this type of technology. At the same time, you have to take into an account the dimension that these beings were in, and especially the knowledge that they had, which would have used more of a sentient type of energy as opposed to a more physical construction. So it is not just what you find encased within the structure itself or how energy was designed to flow, but also how it was connecting with universal energy, which was an important part of the configuration.
Okay, help me to understand then. So if these were some ancient form of a magnetron, operating in a different dimension, obviously. So when we're saying different dimension, if we go back to the earlier conversations we've had on previous shows about the Anunnaki having originally been ninth dimensional, but when they incarnated on Earth, they entered the fifth dimension and eventually descended to the third dimension. So this dimension that you're referring to, was that the fifth dimension that these original stone circles operated in?
Well, we want to answer your question, but we first want to add some context, and it is not our intention to add a level of complexity here, but we think it's important because when a certain dimension is numbered or named, it is assumed to be exactly the same as it would be anywhere else, and even on the same planet in which that dimension existed. For example, if we go back into many of the ancient stories that we have been reviewing, the third dimension was the present reality. But what was created in that third dimension by beings that were accessing higher ones may have made it a completely different reality than the one you exist in today that is the same third dimension. So the consciousness level of the beings that are present within any dimension will determine what is created there, distinguishing it from other dimensions of the same caliber that may actually be completely different in their presentation. So we want to also add that in the third dimension, there are so many factors that come into play that you would not consider today that we think have been hidden from you. For example, just because you live in the third dimension doesn't mean that you cannot tap into free energy. But because these ideas have been suppressed, you haven't been using it to your advantage. So material density can be extremely valuable in terms of technological advancements in a specific reality and dimension, but how that information becomes capped or we'll say suppressed or unavailable is always the deciding factor. Ask us your original question again.
Well, let me add on to what you just said and rephrase the question then. So as an example, based on what you're saying, let me just use a hypothetical scenario and you can tell me if I'm understanding correctly. So what you're saying is we're in the third dimension now, moving to the fifth dimension. And even though the Anunnaki were in the fifth dimension in those ancient times, they were beings who were coming from a ninth dimension. So they had access, many of them perhaps, to, especially Enki maybe, to higher dimensional awareness, knowledge, wisdom. So if we were to attribute that to modern day life that we understand today, it might be, for example, if we had two individuals, one who was tapping into a ninth dimensional consciousness and another who was tapping into a third dimensional consciousness, both of which creating technology. The third dimensional consciousness individual perhaps may use a magnetron to create a laser weapon or a microwave weapon, whereas the ninth dimensional individual may use a magnetron to create some sort of magnetic field that could enhance consciousness or expand consciousness. Is that what you mean?
Well, we want to break down, let's say, the differences here that you've brought to our attention, because it is assumed that the intention behind technology in a third dimensional reality would be lower in its vibration than that of a ninth dimensional one. And this isn't always exactly true, because remember, consciousness is the determining factor in each dimension, but it is the level of material density that you are interacting with that becomes the important mode of creation. So within the third dimension, certainly you could have an individual tapping into the Akashic wisdom of the ninth dimension and actually creating a technology using the material density and richness and resources of the earth that actually does the same thing as an Atlantean type of manifestation. So the difference is, when you have been so suppressed of that Akashic connection, you are going to not see a unified purpose for what you are creating. In fact, that is what has happened within the reality that most of you are creating timelines in today, is that the idea of purpose, especially connected to your collective, is not the common mode of transportation for your creative energy. This has been the greatest loss, we believe. So if you look at someone like Enki, for example, who would have been focused on unifying collectives and creating peace, or ensuring that the earth continues to evolve and each individual soul is contributing to that evolution, you might see a more enlightened type of manifestation than someone who was not as focused in these areas. And this happens today. Of course, you can see it right now on planet Earth. There is a great divide, and that divide has a great deal to do with level of consciousness. And level of consciousness is equal to the energy and information and wisdom that you are able to attain and somehow put into relevant use on a physical planet. And let's play with this idea a little while longer, because we do see a great many humans that are awakening spiritually and able to access the ninth dimension and beyond, and gaining a lot of great information and wisdom for themselves. But where they fall short is they aren't able to make the connection between that realm and the third dimension. And that is another area we believe that is of great concern, often because the speed of vibration here amongst your collective isn't catching up to or equal in its frequency to the individuals that are able to access beyond. And there were many at the time period you are referring to, even though it was a third dimensional reality, that were understanding of these methodologies and spiritual practices and evolving themselves to the point where collectives were forming, and you were seeing enlightened civilizations even at a time when there was great turbulence and chaos.
Okay, let's explore this idea a little further so I can make sure I understand it. So when you're referring to let's just talk about the difference between the ninth dimension and the third dimension just for a moment, just one difference. One difference from my understanding from our previous conversations is the ninth dimension operates more as a collective of beings, whereas the third dimension, we're more individual. Am I on the right track so far?
Yes, we agree with that.
Okay. So in your earlier statement, were you meaning that a being, for example, let's say I'm currently walking in the third dimension, but I'm accessing ninth dimension. And if I were to access ninth dimensional knowledge, wisdom, information, and manifest that into my reality as technology or something else, Is what you're saying that, and many of us you're saying are doing that now, many more conscious individuals are doing that now, are accessing higher dimensions, but because we are unable to translate that into a collective consciousness perspective as those in the ninth dimension would do, the manifestation of that technology becomes more self-serving versus more something that benefits a collective. Am I correct?
We want to add some more context here, and we think that this will help you to understand, because there is quite a difference between identifying with the self and a collective versus holding a unified or coherent field. So what we've talked about in our past conversation has a great deal to do with ego. For example, in the third dimension, you are meant to perceive through an individual perspective. That is how you actually strengthen your collective reality and create coherence and a unified field amongst all. It is the uniqueness and individuality that each soul brings to Earth that is a beneficial component, or the glue that holds the collective together. And as we say this, we know many of you will realize that this has been damaged and deconstructed, because you are using your individuality sometimes to create indifference, or to create arguments, or to hold on tightly to your ideas. And this is what has broken down the relationship that is, we believe, so important to fully manifesting what you're able to access in a higher dimension. Meaning individuals are having incredible experiences in their spiritual access and process. But because the coherence isn't there to bring that into full fruition in a material reality, it often doesn't succeed. And you're moving towards that coherence more and more. And we know many would question, well, we have measured coherence. We know that there is a coherent field on Earth. But the difference between the third and the fifth and even the ninth dimension is the level or the frequency of that coherence. And this relates back to the Schumann, for example, which we've discussed in our past conversations, where it is a capture of all of the living beings on planet Earth. And as it continues to raise, what you'll find is you're moving into higher and higher dimensions. And that's truly where the benefit of being a part of a collective is shown. And it doesn't have to take away your individual perspective just because you've chosen to be a physical being. In the ninth dimension, there's really less need to identify individually or through the ego with something unique that benefits the whole. It's not that individuals lose their sense of self. Even in a ninth dimensional collective, beings are having an experience of being a part of that collective. But there's more natural and organic agreement and less need to differentiate between right and wrong or to judge. And because of that, ninth dimensional realities tend to advance very quickly, whether it be technologically or energetically or even in a state of evolution. The fifth dimension is very similar to the ninth in this way, we believe, except that you're still retaining some of that individual and material expression. Of course, many of you already have created realities in the fifth dimension, and those timelines do exist. And you are having an individual relationship of them, still maintaining your unique identity, but you feel more at peace and at ease, and things are flowing easier, and they are making sense in the physical plane. This, we believe, is what was missing in your third dimension, that many of you are stepping out of and beyond. And so when we talk about the third dimension and ancient civilizations, what we might say is there were many more beings that were present that were accessing the dimensions beyond, creating that coherent field in certain geographic regions. Just like Atlantis, for example, we may have seen similar types of collective expressions in places like Egypt that we have been talking about, Why would that be? Because the number of beings that resided there had higher dimensional access, but also had let go of some of the lower dimensional material expressions of who they were enough to bring those things to full fruition. There was energetic cooperation in a higher coherent field. And you would see this today on planet Earth in a very similar fashion. For example, there are spiritual communities that are blossoming together. Some of them assume to be existing in a coherent and unified state when they truly are not. And there may be other civilizations and communities that are acting on accordance of universal law together as one and flourishing quite easily. So it's not a measurement per se that we would exact in a material sense, but an observation certainly that those of us who are privy to vibration are able to make and to visualize, even in the concentric circles that you brought into the conversation before. This is a sign of very fast-moving, coherent energy. It is the way that the universe demonstrates that it is working. So if we were to look down upon the Earth from the 12th dimension or a plasma ship per se, and look for areas that we believed were representative of higher consciousness or exuding the energy of a higher dimension, this is actually what we would observe is a concentric set of circles manifesting around each other, showing us a certain geographic region or community of people who were all in resonance.
From our previous discussion, if I'm remembering correctly, it was the seventh dimension where the need for the individual egoic expression starts to change to collective. Am I correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. So is it reasonable to assume then that from the third dimension, the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh are easier for us to tap into and bring into fruition into the third dimension because they are still somewhat, to some degree or another, egoic focused?
We absolutely agree with that, yet also want to add that you are all here on an evolutionary journey, which is not related only to a material and physical expression. So some of you are tapping into the 8th, 9th, and 12th dimension here within this universe for the sake of bringing new concepts and philosophies into your awareness or to share them with others, which is just as meaningful and important.
Okay, so taking this understanding back to the story of the Annunaki and these stone circles we discussed, let me just paint the picture and you can tell me if I'm understanding. So it was, first of all, was it Enki who was responsible for overseeing the building of these structures?
Yes.
Okay, and based on what you're saying, my understanding is that Enki, because he was accessing higher dimensions, even though the Anunnaki of his timeline were on Earth during a fifth dimensional expression, he was bringing in a higher dimensional knowledge, wisdom, perhaps even from the ninth dimension, because from previous conversations we talked about how the Anunnaki were originally ninth dimensional until they came to Earth. So far, am I on the right track?
Yes, and we might even say that he was surrounded by many who had similar abilities and were able to do the same.
Okay, and because he was from the ninth dimension, then entering the fifth dimension, and able to access his ninth dimensional knowledge and wisdom, are you saying that he still perceived the fifth dimensional reality on Earth as more of a collective expression versus the fifth dimension that we are entering now is still somewhat individualized or ego-based?
Well, it has less to do with the perception and more to do with the actual reality. And remember, this wasn't the case on the whole of the Earth. We're speaking of very select geographic regions and areas and communities that were thriving in a higher dimensional reality simply because the convergence of multiple souls with the ability to hold coherence high enough to bring it into manifestation were all assembled there.
Okay, so these stone circles were not exactly fifth dimensional then, if I'm understanding correctly. They were a higher dimensional understanding or technology that was manifested into the then fifth dimension, correct?
It is correct, yet we find it difficult to actually put a dimensional label on a technology like this, because anytime a technology comes into manifestation that is accessing higher dimensional wisdom or Akashic history, it is going to manifest multidimensionally, meaning it has a connection to the earth at that time. And even if the earth exists in 2 or 3 different dimensions, is going to draw on the energy, the elements, the material of those dimensions and have to express it into a higher form. So we can't say the technology itself was made of one dimension, but we can say that the input into it certainly was multidimensional, making it express in that way.
Okay, now with all this understanding, let's go back to the purpose of these stone circles in South Africa. Now, as I said before, there are at least 100,000, perhaps millions of them. What you said they serve some purpose to access the energy of the earth. What exactly were they used for?
So if we break down each technology individually and we were to look inside in terms of its construction, what we would see is a power generator, tapping into a very precious and potent area of the earth that was transposing the energy into a form of light. So taking a material energy like gold, for example, or even crystal, and using the vibration of it in order to create a field. Now, just like the Pyramid Collective, for example, these areas were mapped out because of a very specific ground level meridian complex that was known to carry precious resource even from the inner crystalline core of Gaia. So we don't think it's a coincidence necessarily that gold was found in these various areas, because where there are precious ley lines and meridians that channel energy from the center core of Gaia, you are always going to find the most valued precious minerals, because there is alchemy that is taking place from the amount of energy actually coming through the earth herself. And that is why these areas were chosen to actually amplify the vibration of that entire geographic region. Now, we also mentioned that these were used as a telecommunication type of device. And we want to spend some time here because the very definition of communication today, it's quite different in a physical sense than what a ninth dimensional enlightened being would have expected, because it is less focused on a verbal translation of information and more focused on the ability to exchange energy and information from multiple sources. Very much like tapping into the Akashic records. You're tapping not into a deliberate library of information. You're tapping into energy that has to be translated and then prioritized. And if the earth has wisdom within her, and it actually exists as a portal herself, imagine being able to translate energy and information coming in from multiple sources throughout the cosmos. This was one of the most important advantages of these technologies, meaning those who were present on the earth were tapping into information and energy and wisdom from planets beyond in order to put it to good use on the physical earth itself. And this had many similarities to the 369 prophecies that we've discussed in these various transmissions as well, where a pyramid is creating an unbroken signal between the earth and the universe. We can set up a series of telecommunication technologies that can do a similar thing, but have a more physical impact. And that is why they remained so close to the earth. In addition to this, there were many benefits. Later, it was discovered that to step into the field that these areas were creating could have the benefit of physical healing. It could also change the aura of a physical soul to expand outward multiple times, again, in order to receive its own communication or to even balance its energy fields. Further, you discussed the material benefit of refining gold, and we want to change that terminology from the word refine to actually alchemize, because remember, if the earth was doing the good work of alchemizing elements and we were tapping into the energy of those elements, we were somehow creating an exchange of information, which is always beneficial, meaning working with the earth in concert. These technologies were having a positive impact on the actual gold and elements themselves.
All right, let me make sure I understand. I want to try to understand the mechanics of these stone circles and how they operated and their purpose. Now, another detail about these stone circles is they, in many cases, are interconnected by a web of different channels that, for example, like a water channel that seems to feed into them. And some theories were that gold was going through these channels to each of these circles. So are you suggesting that gold may have been used as I want to loosely use the word fuel, or to create this energy inside these stone circles?
We could use the term energetic source, that the gold was used as an energetic source in order to create a field or in order to tap into its energy. But it had a multiple use because the gold itself was considered very valuable and precious. The water connections that you are speaking of came much later. So as the technology continued to evolve, it was noticed that if we were to connect the various technologies beneath the earth using waterways or channels of water, which are energy also, we could further clarify all of the alchemy that was going on energetically in a physical sense. So it isn't the movement necessarily of the gold from one location to another that was the intention for these channels. More so, it had the effect of amplifying the actual energetic output that was capable of these devices. And you're asking us about the mechanics and especially the circular energy that was generated within them. This created a vortex, yet the vortex wasn't necessarily contained within the structure itself. Again, this is an energetic technology, so it is not something that could be seen with the naked eye, but certainly felt and measured by those who were technologically advanced and especially advanced in their consciousness or more evolved. And this vortex, very much like a vortex that you would see anywhere on the earth, was amplifying the field through which telecommunication, healing, and energy could be utilized. Those that were existent on the planet at that time knew that the inner earth contained very valuable frequencies and were utilizing them for the benefit of the earth as a whole, but also for each other in order to keep their resonance high and in order to exchange information at a very high dimensional rate and speed. In addition to this, we can say that beneath the earth, a great many changes actually took place because of these technologies. Not in a detrimental way necessarily, but much of what you've seen on the surface of the earth in terms of carvings on the sides of mountainous ranges or clearing of areas for the building of temples. The inner earth was a very important area for the Anunnaki and many others to understand and explore. And they did not have the capabilities that the reptilians had in terms of their inner alchemy and being able to use sound, for example, and energy to clear these spaces. So these technologies were observed for the purpose and the possibility of doing similar things within the inner earth, creating tunnels or caverns or research stations or observation areas that could later even house technologies and ships, for example, and many of those areas still remain today.
What we know about Enki is that he was tasked with mining gold, among other things, and also worked in genetics. We've discussed this in previous conversations. There's no mention that I know of in current ancient texts anyway of this type of device you're referring to now. And so I'm trying to understand in the context of the role that Enki played in the Anunnaki civilization at that time, where does this technology fit? What was the, or is it something different than what we currently know of him?
Well, it is not different necessarily, other than the fact that much of what you are translating from ancient history is coming through the limitation of the linear and material minds that you are using in order to understand better the purpose of these periods. And it wasn't just a material purpose ever, because if these were intergalactic beings, coming from a more advanced civilization, certainly material would have been important to them, and gold was an important part of their purpose and observation, while at the same time, energy and vibration would have always been considered in the construction of anything that they were focused on. So unlike today, and again, we can compare and contrast, technological advancements are happening very, very quickly in this reality, and you must always consider the intention behind the advancement and whether or not it is benefiting humanity or it is somehow diminishing your value. What we've noticed, however, is there is a very material nature to everything that you're creating, a very physical and tangible connection to your bodies and to the earth. And that isn't wrong necessarily, but where you're moving is a focus more on vibration. And so the beings who were present, who were highly conscious, perhaps not always in the best intention, but very aware of their Akashic past, would have had a multi-purpose to everything that they were creating.
So did these stone circles primarily then serve the purpose similar to what we discussed in previous conversations about how the pyramids around the world are creating a certain field on the planet to produce a certain effect for the collective? Was that the purpose of these stone circles, this technology that Enki built, or was it primarily for their own goal of refining or producing gold, or all of it?
Well, there is a distinction between the intention behind the pyramids versus these technologies, and the primary focus for that is the difference between the earth versus a collective or a group of beings, meaning the pyramid structures on earth are created in harmony with the whole of the earth. They are not one, they are many. They are a collective meant to work in unison to hold a constant and powerful connection to the universe. Whereas these technologies were more limited in their focus, not necessarily considering the whole of the earth, but the betterment of a community or a group of beings, such that there could be prosperity and also more knowledge and understanding about the value of the energy and elements that existed within the inner earth.
And so is that primarily what Enki created these for bettering the community in that immediate area, or bettering the whole Anunnaki community that was at that point on Earth, or something else?
Well, certainly there was the goal of understanding the entire Earth as a resource, and we cannot discount that, because the Anunnaki are very interested in the not only genetics of the human race and how they are intertwined with the planet that they chose, but also how the earth generates precious resource that is also a hybrid factor of the energy of Gaia herself. So much of this was started as a research project, even though it may have taken different twists and turns. Remember, the Anunnaki are very focused on research and understanding better the relationship of energy to material. And this may have been the beginning of the creation of these technologies, where many others became involved later on, adding their own influences and better understanding their capabilities, which continued to evolve and progress them even further.
As we've discussed in previous conversations, some of these ancient sites retain some sort of energetic properties that still exist to this day, even though maybe not to the same degree as in ancient times when they were built. Is there any residual effect or benefit to these stone structures today, or have they been pretty much disabled because they've weathered or been destroyed?
When we look at the energetic impact of these technologies, we see dormancy in that respect, meaning how they were tuned and maintained to hold a certain frequency on the surface isn't necessarily present any longer. But any time that a technology like this is put into motion, we must always consider the changes that go on beneath the inner earth. And remember, these were focused on alchemy, and it was not just gold that became alchemized in the process. What we see today, if you were to look beneath the inner earth in this region, is a variety of passageways that have become connected and very highly stable, actually, in their ability to generate energy. And it's why it is such still today an area of very rich resource and wealth beneath the earth. Some may even feel that tangible energy as they exist there physically, because what the Anunnaki have learned, and what many others before them and after them have also validated, is that while the earth begins to change, the human beings that are connected to her will reap the rewards. And at times you have ebbed and flowed through these transitions where elements have alchemized and your literal heartbeats have changed because the vibration of the inner earth is causing a fluctuation in your heart connection or coherence. And we think that is one of the valuable aspects left behind is there's a very strong connection and pathway that has been created through Gaia's meridians that holds a certain frequency, and when tapped into can support not only human healing, but even beyond that. It has an ascendant type of quality where a soul may come to visit without even knowing that these things existed, and then have an awakening or an awareness of many past lives simultaneously. This isn't because the technologies are still working, but it's because the greatest technology that exists within you is equal to the elements that are deep within Gaia. your own elemental structure can become alchemized and rearranged simply because of the fact that Gaia's inner chambers are holding the possibility of doing that. It's ultimately why, even in civilizations like Egypt, for example, you see the use of so much gold. It isn't that it was seen as an expression of wealth, so much as it was an alchemist's most valuable tool, whether it was used on the skin or ingested or used as an amulet within space or in a technology. It had the possibility of lifting the vibration and holding a certain coherent field. And this today still exists, even in areas beyond the one we are speaking of.
Now, does that knowledge of gold still exist today? For example, in the Vatican, there's an immense amount of gold. Are they aware of these other properties, or is it primarily for them just a wealth and power sort of thing now?
Well, the idea of gold as wealth and power has been seeded within human minds. It is not to say that gold isn't wealthy, but the value that you've put on it actually determines its worth, because anything on planet Earth can be seen as valuable and worthy, dependent upon its perspective. But certainly, the more technological and sentient benefits of gold are the reason the Vatican would be in so much possession of this element. It is not only that, but it creates a connection to this Annunaki lineage, which we believe has been of great importance, not only in Catholic religion or in the Vatican, but in many of these wealthy areas that are assumed to hold gold. We know that, of course, if gold is used as a symbol or a tool or an agent of enlightenment, it must be changed from the property that it is in. And we're not saying that the Vatican is doing any of this transformation, yet the possibility of the transformation is why it is so valuable and why it is held in such regard. Even those that hold it may not consider that it is needed because they believe that they are living out a legacy or a lineage that proves them worthy of beyond having to alchemize anything. So they may be hiding some of it from the greater collective in order to suppress consciousness or to prohibit those who understand its transcendent value to utilize it in that fashion.
One of the more well-known locations is in the stone circles in South Africa, is referred to as Adam's calendar, and the reason being that all these different sites have certain sacred geometric properties that, and in particular with Adam's calendar, that seem to align with constellations and different planetary movement. Now, that seems to be a common thing with a lot of ancient sites, but also in particular stone circles around the world, that they have certain solar or galactic alignments. Now, is that because many conventional archaeologists believe that these locations, such as Adam's calendar or Stonehenge, for example, were specifically built in order to, as observational sites to observe the solar system and also to time different solstices and so on? Was that actually their purpose, in particular, for example, with Adam's calendar? Or is it, as we've discussed before, that in ancient times they used certain means of architecture through the understanding of feng shui or vastu shastra that would, as a result of that sacred geometric alignment, they would have just naturally built these structures in accordance with those techniques, and as a result they just happen to align to different galactic different constellations and star systems and so on?
Well, it would have been no mistake that in ancient civilizations there would be calendars that helped them to understand the various influences and seasons that they were apt to go through. In addition to this, it would help them to understand time in a galactic sense, because many of them were hybrids coming from other dimensions and were here on planet Earth. So the orientation to their own home star system would have been extremely important in order to better understand their own evolutionary path and whether they were evolving in alignment with it. At the same time, we want to acknowledge that in some of these areas where you're seeing these calendars, the purpose may not have been understanding the alignment to various star systems and planets at all. It may have been more a measurement of how the technologies surrounding it were actually working. Because if we were creating a field and that field was for the purpose of higher vibration or coherence amongst a collective, any vibrational shift or timeline shift would have shown a change in the calendar, even if slight, other than what it had already known. And it's very much like what humanity is experiencing today, as we had a very lengthy discussion about the pole shift, for example, and how the Earth turns on its axis, and there are very slight shifts in her location within the collective galaxy. And because of that, information begins to flow differently. We have access to new areas we did not have before, and this is because the collective is ready for the next level understanding or ascendant ability. And so many of those who were privy to the movements of planets and stars, and especially the Earth, were researching and tracking how some of the technologies that they had created were either working or not working. And also it helped them to know the direction that they were heading as a collective itself. Those that were in charge or responsible for maintaining, for example, these various sites would have created ceremony and certain prayers of divination at times when the energies were going to be intense. They may have opened up a portal in order to clear them or to strengthen the field of protection around them, such that they could not be somehow manipulated or changed from their original state. So yes, we agree with what you're saying, but we also wanted to add there are many other purposes that these may have been used for.
And were these structures, the stone circles in South Africa we've been discussing, were these built prior to the Great Flood, the cataclysm from 13,000 years ago?
Yes, we agree they were.
And the destruction that we see today with this entire site, where it appears that many of these stone circles have either weathered or maybe have just been destroyed, was that the result of the Great Flood occurrence that they got destroyed?
It was in part, yes. Any type of cataclysm of this magnitude is going to cause destruction to a technology like this. And remember, these are different than the pyramids. We spoke a great deal about the templates that were used in the alchemy of elements and how the entire site around a pyramid, for example, was of value even beneath the inner earth. These technologies were a bit different. They didn't involve such intricacies and so much transposing of energy and elements prior to their construction. So that is why today there is more dormancy in these areas. But we also must consider that there was constant upkeep and attunement of them. And that in part is also the reason why they are dormant today. If you would have a return, for example, of some of the original beings who created them, who understood their workings, they could be reactivated, we might say, with very little effort. But remember, you're existing in a different timeline, even if it may be a similar dimension, where the consciousness needs to support the intention of the technology, or else it cannot come to a full manifestation. And that applies here as it did in our previous explanation.
We've discussed previously how the different construction techniques of the reptilians, who typically preferred highly dense environments like inside mountains or underground, and they use their inner technology to carve their structures entirely from a single piece of stone or mountainside or rock formation, whereas the Anunnaki, or in particular in Egypt, the technology was more external. They used light ships and frequencies to create the different structures like the pyramids. Now the stone circles in South Africa, which also were attributed to Enki, just like Egypt, were much smaller stones, stones that anybody could lift and move. How were these structures built?
These were absolutely more mechanically and physically constructed, even though the inner technology itself was more of a highly conscious manifestation. So it was the contribution of both, we would say, those who were enlightened and understanding how to work with technologies of sound or even visualize through their own plasma how the technology should come into formation. But what you're seeing in the physical construction, it was the cooperative effort of many who had gathered with both the curiosity and the excitement to see it come to full fruition.
Were these other beings from the Anunnaki race, or were these also some of the human beings referred to previously as the forest people that the Annunaki modified to be their workers?
A combination of both, we might say, but also we want to keep in mind that it wasn't just either or at the time, because there were many different levels of hybrid beings that were existing on the planet that may have also contributed.
And Gambia and also Senegal, which are also in the proximate region, they're in the African continent. There are also other stone circles, but they're entirely different in structure from the ones we just discussed. They are not, they're more like a pillar formation stone circles that we see in different parts of the world. Some are circular and some are more like more squared off shapes. What purpose, obviously it's a different type of structure. Did they serve a different purpose there when you see these kinds of structures?
These are fashioned more like an antenna and are designed to be a part of a larger technological suite, or we'll say collective of manifestations. And much of this has also been destroyed, obviously. But if you look at the inner workings here, what you would see is something that addresses the energy more like a tuning fork, using the various material energy of these locations, but also programming it in order to interpret signals that may have been coming in from off planet or may have been sent from the other side of the planet or different geographic regions.
When we see stone circles in general, should we always assume that that might have been their intention, or do they, at different parts of the world, serve different purposes?
It's hard for us to say that they would all be similar, depending upon their usage and their intention, because these stone circles may have housed a variety of different apparatus or even energetic programs that were put into place for different purposes.
Okay, let's talk about a new site that's been excavated in recent years called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. And actually there are several sites that have been discovered around Göbekli Tepe that have very similar structure, so it's not one site. But it has a very unique design, but also could be considered a stone circle, although it kind of has more of a vortex kind of shape. They are assuming that there are many floors to the structure, and they've only really excavated the top floor at the moment. So now these pillars are more T-shaped. They've done some dating using some scientific methods and have dated the structure to about 12,000 years ago. Now, conventional archaeologists believe that this structure, once built, was on purpose buried by the people who built it to serve as a time capsule for future generations. But I'm wondering if the dating is even remotely correct, that it was 12,000 years ago that this was built, that the burial might have been because of the Great Flood that occurred and not because they intentionally built it just to bury it.
This is a much more ancient site than what it has been dated to be. In fact, we could say it goes all the way back to the origins of your planet. We see this more as an intergalactic gathering space for many of the hybrids who would have come to Earth at the time, whether they were coming on ships or whether they were arriving in a form of light. And the city itself is something we want to explain because it has been modified over time, of course, in order to suit various other collectives that may have been present on the planet. So what you may be excavating today is not the original form of what would have been present at the time we are speaking of. And what you may notice is a very similar quality to some of the renderings of ancient temples and reptilian architecture that we have been talking about primarily throughout these various discussions. And it is not to say it is a reptilian structure at all, but those that came very early on in the seeding of humanity, we know that they came from multiple locations with different history and a different purpose. And it was important to them to leave that history behind, whether it be in the form of an ancient library or a demonstration of how they may have lived beyond the earth. This was the contribution and the formation of what you now know as Göbekli Tepe, which ultimately had a landing pad at the very tip of or top of the structure for a variety of different types of ships that were coming in for the purpose of exploring and observing what was happening at the time, even taking various genetic samples of some of the new hybrid humans that were coming into form. There is a very important connection to underground waterways with this site as well. And we want to explain exactly why, because the water within the central core of Gaia is what feeds and nourishes all that you see on the outer edge or the surface. But the generation of that water is self-sustaining within your planet, very much like within your own body, your cells are holding and generating that water, which is actually attuned to light. And in this location, the connection to Gaia's underground waterways and the use of that water in order to hold the frequency of light was extremely important. It is what helped to create the structure itself, using technologies like the being's own plasma, as well as different technologies that were brought in from various cosmic locations.
Okay, so from what I understand, only maybe 1 or 2% of this site has been excavated at the moment. And as I said, there are many other similar sites in the vicinity that haven't even been started yet. So as far as I know, no water has been found yet, but they are anticipating that this one structure goes down many levels. So you're saying somewhere underneath there is a water source.
Somewhat like a power generator, yes, except the power was not a physical type of power that you would generate today, more accessing the light and the vibration of the inner earth in order to sustain the beings who are coming in various forms of that light.
Is this similar if we look at, for example, many Egyptian sites such as the Sirian in Egypt? We see many floors, and we also see water coming up from underneath the ground. In fact, many of the levels of that particular structure are still underwater. Was water a key component in many of these structures for that purpose?
Always, always, for a variety of reasons. But most important was, again, the access to light and energy that was present within the water itself.
In the case of Göbekli Tepe, was this used? Now, you said it goes back to the origins of Earth, so the origins of the seeding of humanity as well, or was it there at that time?
We believe this is one of the original structures that may have been present on Earth at the very beginning of time, prior even to the seeding of humanity. Because you must keep in mind that the beings who decided to come from many, many different locations had to first establish some semblance of home, such that they were able to be directed on their path and do the work that they came to do. And they would have been a unified collective regardless of the different races of origin. They were establishing a new human race. And for that, they had to give up some of the comforts of home and let go of how they identified differently of each other. This may have been the reason they chose to reside together in a structure like this, somewhat creating a design that could be mimicked in civilizations beyond.
Now, this particular site, all we see today are stone pillars that are T-shaped, and you mentioned there was a landing pad. Now, there is no remains of any kind of a landing pad that exists today. Was that because it was washed away, or when you're saying a landing pad, what does that actually look like?
Well, a structure of this magnitude could never have been destroyed by human hands. So we do want to affirm that the Great Flood was a big part of the collapse of this structure and its burial. At the same time, we also alluded to the idea that throughout time, it had been modified. And if a landing pad was present today, you may see it looking very similar to what you are familiar with in a modern day airport, but without all of the physical guideposts and signs. It is not to say that it had to be a concrete structure necessarily, but it had to indicate a specific location on the earth that many were gathering. And this was often done with vibrational fields, meaning the landing pad was a technology in and of itself, having the ability to telecommunicate with a variety of different races throughout the universe, such that different forms of ships could come in, whether they be physical or whether they be plasma. And the pad itself would have the capability to adapt to these various forms of ships and energy fields. Of course, any time that ships are landing anywhere in the universe, on any planet or on any star system, there would be some type of a portal technology through which they would enter. So the very site of Göbekli Tepe then must be considered a portal in and of itself. And this speaks very well to the location in which it was constructed and how it was chosen to interface with the inner earth and the inner earth water in order to create a bridge, in other words, between the earth and the multi-dimensional universe.
So was this structure in particular originally used for other purposes than just a landing pad? For example, was it a place where beings resided or in physical form, or just a meeting place, as you said? What other purposes did it serve?
Well, it was both, and it is a massive structure. So we have to speak to the idea of transformation and hybridization. There were chambers that were built within this structure in order for beings to spend time adjusting to the new atmosphere that they found themselves in, whether they were transforming from light and plasma into physical, or whether they were somehow manifesting their physical form differently than what they had known before. And these technologies were extremely advanced. Star-shaped configurations were utilized to house various beings from different locations, in which they would rest and receive a variety of different injections of whether that be light, plasma, or energy. There were also areas of instruction, somewhat like a school. Now, it is not a school in which there was one authority that was teaching on a subject to all those who would come to reside there, but a place of contribution where many would come together to offer what they knew about the earth and had observed from afar, and share some of their research and why they had come. And this was all exchanged very purposely so that everyone could benefit and take away what others had come to know. We also believe that the entire site is built somewhat like a vibrational library, leaving the history behind of these various beings. And it is why you will see different forms of construction utilized in the entire structure, because ultimately it represents a variety of different races all coming together in order to leave something behind. So when you use the term time capsule, we want to affirm that it seems quite suiting, not necessarily that it was meant to be unearthed and discovered at a certain time, but everyone was offering a part of their own Akashic history such that the earth could understand exactly, or so that humanity could understand, in other words, exactly where they had come from and who had lent their DNA.
Amy, you briefly mentioned the reptilians in conjunction with the building of the structure. Now, as we've discussed in previous conversations, reptilians typically seem to use their inner technology to carve from stone. These structures appear to be more like blocks that were stacked, which seems to be more of an Annunaki or even some other races. There is some creative design, although the reptilians typically seem to have been very ornate. This particular structure, the glyphs or art that was left on them seems very primitive by comparison to what we typically see with reptilians. Now, first of all, when you're saying that it was rebuilt over time, now they've only excavated a very small portion of it, and they believe that it goes down many layers. So would we find even older layers that have maybe more intricate ancient architecture as we go down lower, and who built it?
We agree that you will see some reptilian influence in some of the more ornate chambers, yet we also want to advise that the reptilians would not have been primarily focused on residing in these areas. Remember, they were more in solitude and attempting to retain their DNA and their energy outside of where many would gather as one. It does not mean, however, that some of the original reptilians that came to Earth did not have some influence in this structure. And yes, certainly that would be revealed as you continue to unearth the structure itself. You mentioned that there were changes to the construction, and this is something we want to clarify. It wasn't necessarily that the structure was physically changed, but over time it became inhabited and perhaps slightly modified by certain groups of beings. And there is some Annunaki influence here as well, where the Annunaki took ownership for a period of time of a portion, a very significant portion of this civilization, we'll call it, or structure. And because of that, you're seeing more of their influence here as well. At the same time, it being a portal and also a technology, it is apt to change in order to suit the Earth, dependent upon the timeline and dimension that the Earth is in. So that is a difficult, more difficult concept, we think, to to explain, but we can give a very simplistic understanding. If you were to look back at the previous decade, for example, or even 2 decades from now, you would see very stark changes in the type of housing, for example, or the type of clothing that human beings would wear. These things have been slight modifications based upon your consciousness and influences and various preferences, for example. And the same goes for ancient sites, even though you believe that what you're perceiving comes from the moment in which it was created. All material manifestations will adapt according to the level of consciousness and dimension that you perceive them in. And we know this is a very hard concept for humans to adapt to, because it assumes that what you are perceiving is constantly going to change based on the perception. And we have to affirm that that is the way of the universe, and it truly is. So the second your scientists define what a sacred site is, they have already limited what it may have been before or what it assumes it will be. And this is something that you should apply to everything that you are seeing on the plane of the earth.
Well, from that context, vast majority of scientists and conventional archaeologists believe almost all of these sites around the world to be tombs for people who have died, including the stone circles and the pyramids and so on. Is this just simply their inability to see beyond the third dimension or to perceive things beyond a certain vantage point because of their own mental constructs of reality, and maybe even their influence or let's say brainwashing through the educational system that led to their academic degrees? Or is there an overarching influence, such as world leaders who are planting these ideas into the minds of the archaeologists so that the whole of the rest of society believes that these structures were used simply for burial sites?
Well, we believe it is both. And we want to explain first that the lowering of consciousness that has happened on your planet, especially in areas of ancient archaeology, has been profound. And we are talking about a targeted lowering of consciousness, meaning there are certain people who have been put into position to explain to the masses what things were before. And they have been lowered in their consciousness to the degree that they both believe what they are speaking, but also are speaking on behalf of those who do not want the truth to come out. And this is the case in many of your prominent professional positions, even throughout history. Yet at the same time, we know that the human collective has come up in a very flat, material, third-dimensional reality. So what you have learned in your schools and what you have been taught, even from professionals and scientists and doctors, has reflected your own perception. And that perception is now changing, which is why the masses are beginning to question these very notions that everything was built as a burial ground. And we want to speak to that momentarily, because much of what is perceived as being constructed for burial was not for that purpose whatsoever. These underground chambers, technologies, various stone circles, as you call them, they were so revered for their power that those who were in power may have wanted to use them as a burial location to be recognized as if they took ownership of them. But the purpose was certainly not that. And this is why you may find throughout history, as you unearth some of these ancient locations, burials actually did take place. So it's easy to make the assumption that that would have been their purpose, when in fact, those that were buried there were attempting to stake claim to something such that their legacy would show they had some ownership to it.
So to clarify, what you're saying is that the those that are buried in many of these sites were not the original builders. They just assumed ownership of that location at a later time, and because of the reverence for these locations, they assumed ownership and chose to be buried there in acknowledgement of their power.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Now, in the case of Egypt, we've talked about how light ships were used to build these structures, and Göbekli Tepe are also very megalithic stones, extremely large and heavy. How were these built?
Very similar, yet we do want to acknowledge that there was a particular energetic technology at the time that was brought from off planet that was used to create this structure. It is Syrian in its origins, but it does not account for the entire structure being of Syrian influence, meaning the Sirians had assumed responsibility for architecting, we will say, the design that many had contributed to in a very efficient format that was brought on multiple ships and assembled on planet Earth. And this is, in a simplistic fashion, a sound technology similar to the ships that would have been using vibration and light through a template. It was generating different frequencies at different rates of speed in order to cut stone and to move it into perfect symmetry. In addition to this, there was some pre-preparation of the grounds, terraforming, in other words, to create a template for the structure to rest upon. Remember, the underground waterways were extremely important, so the access to those were of first and primary consideration. And these technologies were later housed on planet Earth as a replica for others to both utilize and copy, as well as to advance forward as they changed some of the dynamics and used them on other structures.
Now, is this the reason why the Sirius connection you're mentioning, a lot of the sites around the world seem to be aligned to Sirius, or the Orion cluster, even the pyramids in Egypt as well? Is that connection?
It's a bit more complicated than just the connection of a technology. So we want to spend some time just explaining what we know of this and how it has continued to evolve, because many would assume that the purpose for the alignment to these planets and influences has to do with harnessing the energy. And certainly this is true, but if the Earth has evolved, the way in which that energy comes to the Earth has also changed over time. As some of these structures were created, those that were in charge or taking responsibility of their creation would call upon ancient masters and architects in these various cosmic locations, Orion, for example, and Sirius, because of their level of expertise, not only in technology and architecture itself, but especially with material landforms. So even though we might consider a star system like Sirius or Orion to be focused more in light, they still adapt very well to different levels of material and focus on it, because there is an understanding that material energy is some of the most valuable throughout the universe. The alignment to these star systems had more to do with the exchange of information at the very beginning of these constructions than it did harnessing the energy afterwards. Because if light ships were coming in and technologies were being utilized, it was important to maintain some level of communication with the structure afterwards. Those that would leave the planet Earth and go back to their home star system were often charged with constant observation and ensuring the attunement and clearing of these various structures. Later, what the ancients began to realize is when perfect alignments were made, the energies were so strong that profound transformations could happen in form, whether it was material alchemy or within the physical body or spiritual bodies. And this is a side benefit, we believe, of some of these original decisions. So you're certainly seeing the progression or the manifestation of an original decision that was made becoming something very valuable in the long term that still exists today, that humans are able to reap the rewards of.
Now, when we're discussing Sirius, are the beings who came from Sirius primarily the lion beings we see depicted in ancient times?
This is a hybrid manifestation of the Sirians presenting themselves in an earthly fashion. And yes, in Sirius, there is the presentation of a lioness type of being. Yet, remember, there's a certain level of non-physical that these beings have adapted to, which does not require them to manifest in material at all. So the presentation of the lion being is more depiction of what they may have looked like as they hybridized to the earth.
So when we see iconography of the lion from ancient times, like the Great Sphinx we discussed last time, and even to modern times, the Lion's Gate iconography as well, are we primarily referring to the Sirians then?
Yes, primarily.
And what about the Orion constellation? What collective of beings were coming from influence there?
Well, the Orion star system is home to many different beings. Much like planet Earth, there has been a seeding that took place there and a hybridization based upon that seeding. And these are star beings, meaning they exist more in a form of light as opposed to physical. And they have evolved to become more electromagnetic in their presentation, meaning they hold some still material and magnetic energy that holds them together as a collective. And they are very advanced at traveling throughout the galaxy and measuring different frequencies between, or we'll say in relationship between stars, planets, and groups of collectives. And this was perhaps one of their most important roles as they came to planet Earth. And on the Earth, they may be recognized in a variety of different hybrid forms, not just one. They were charged with research and measuring how the frequency of Earth would change as certain structures were brought into a physical manifestation, even how the various elements of Earth would affect the frequency of a technology or a structure. And they still do this today, not only for the Earth, but for many different cosmic races throughout the universe.
We've discussed many kinds of beings, such as the Sirians and the Pleiadians and so on. Was there a particular group of beings that came from Orion that we would identify with a particular name today?
The name is not something we would say is a common in terms of your ancient history, but the term humanoid is something that we would use only because the beings from Orion, as they manifested into physical form, took on a more humanoid presentation, looking much more like you than you would even expect. And at times, the ability for them to shapeshift was very profound, much like we have discussed with the reptilians. Even in different star systems, they have manifested like a humanoid presentation, even though they are not on an earthly planet. So they're very much like you, again, in terms of their structure and even their DNA and their physical to non-physical orientation. It is just that they're able to choose between one or the other, where you are working with the combined physical and non-physical vibrations.
And in what dimensional consciousness did the Orion humanoid beings exist when they came to Earth?
They are 10th to 11th dimensional beings at the time of the Earth's seeding, only because in the 12th dimension, the beings that exist in Orion are a multi-leveled council that spend the majority of their time focused on universal priorities. We talk about the Council of Light quite often, and the Orion Council has a very important role in that collective. As they have gained a great deal of knowledge and information about different energetic channels that run between planets and different beings and how they communicate and how they exchange. At the same time, we note that we haven't discussed the 10th or the 11th dimension. We've only gone up through the 9th. And just like that 7th dimension is the shift from ego and identity into a more collective presentation, between the 9th and the 10th, beings are really losing that sense of having to identify with material at all. So remember, we said even in a 9th dimensional collective, there can be some expression of material. There is a perception or an experience of the collective that you are a part of. From the 10th to the 11th and the 12th dimension, the state of merging becomes more, we'll say, exclusive, in that there is no attachment whatsoever to being in a physical state. And that is why with their arrival on planet Earth, they would have chosen to express more in a humanoid form because it's so different from the collective vibration they would have maintained previously.
And what are the Sirians? What dimensional expression did they have?
Well, we want to clarify because we know we were speaking of Göbekli Tepe and we were speaking about the original seeding, and those that came at the very beginning of time to Earth all existed in a 12th dimensional reality. They were the original seeders that called upon others to join them. At the same time, Sirians throughout history have come in different dimensional forms to planet Earth. And this is why you see the presentation of so many different lion type of hybrids, because some of them have been 9th dimensional upon arrival, while others have been 11th or 12th dimensional in their presentation.
And when we see beings like this depicted in Egypt, for example, a lot of the iconography in Egypt depicts various humanoid, animal sort of merging beings, like Sekhmet, for example. Was that their actual physical expression in hybrid form on Earth?
In some cases, yes. But remember, in the capture of a physical being in ancient times, a great deal of symbology may have been used in order to show a certain lineage, for example, or a connection to a cosmic race, and that may have been amplified in its presentation in order to suit the desires or the needs of the being itself.
So let's just use Sekhmet as a specific example then in this case. Did she actually appear in a physical form, in a carbon-based form on Earth in Egypt, in that Egyptian timeline, as a lion-headed humanoid being? Or was she some other kind of being and was just depicted that way to indicate her Sirian origins?
In terms of the lioness head, the way that she is depicted is more a linear representation of her Sirian lineage than how she would have been presented. However, we would not see her necessarily looking like a human as you would look today. There would be more of a crossover in terms of the characteristics of a Sirian versus a human. So especially around the eyes, we would say the lioness or cat-like eyes that you have seen depicted in ancient Egypt and in many of the gods and goddesses truly do represent the way the eyes would have been shown. There would have been a smaller neck, for example, or even limbs, not because these physical beings were any less material than you were, but their hybrid form operated, their structures, for example, operated far differently, even in terms of metabolism or working with light, than humans do. The lioness head and shape we want to speak to for a moment, because some of the Sirians were actually able to shapeshift at will. We've talked about shapeshifting in terms of the reptilians, but it's just a slightly different process with the Sirians than the reptilians. Remember, the reptilians are using mind, and the mind is their main mode of expression in terms of material manifestation. Sirians operate a bit differently. When they are feeling as if they want to take a more prominent position of either recognition, for example, as a god or a goddess or authority, they are capable of tapping into their more Sirian genetics and to bring that through to be demonstrated in a literal sense. And often Sekhmet, for example, who may have been faced with challenging circumstances, would have chosen to do this to present more of a warrior type of configuration. It is very much like if a human being were in a state of fear, and that fear would alchemically change the body in order to perform feats of magic. The hybrids were able to tap into the power of their pure genetics and bring them to Earth in very mysterious ways. But we also want to clarify that you used the word carbon. And it is complex for us to explain, yet also important to note that any hybrid that exists on a physical plane is not fully carbon in its presentation, because to become a manifestation of light or to shapeshift, you must be operating in both the carbon and crystalline DNA simultaneously. So the use of the word carbon isn't exactly correct in this circumstance, yet we understand what you are referring to.
Would that also be true of human beings today, such as individuals who may be operating in third to fifth dimensional consciousness? Is that what you're getting at, that the carbon-based elements may be there, and that's the physical components, but we're also drawing on multidimensional elements to formulate our human experience?
Correct. Yes. And the level to which you are operating in your crystalline DNA determines how you are able to manifest material. It is the amazing capability of that suite of DNA strands that, when merged with the carbon, enables a soul to completely transform. But at the same time, and we have acknowledged this often, dimension aside, you have chosen to be human. And to be human, you have chosen to focus on a physical body and physical material. And we don't think you're leaving that behind. What your crystalline DNA will help you to do is to override some of the carbon-based programs and patterns that you have been repeating constantly throughout history. And this includes things like disease, for example. Being able to live above and beyond the diseases of your ancestry truly requires that you activate as much of that crystalline DNA as possible.
We previously discussed what scientists refer to as junk DNA, and how junk DNA is actually our carbon-based components of our DNA, not the crystalline DNA. My question about that is, so just to differentiate what that carbon-based junk DNA could be, those are characteristics that would affect our physical expression, if I'm understanding correctly what you're saying. For example, perhaps in our junk DNA, there was some sort of deactivation as a result of the Annunaki DNA experiments on human beings that could have limited our lifespan. So being a very physical carbon-based characteristic, not necessarily a crystalline DNA component. Am I understanding correctly?
You are, and we want to remind everyone that the 12-strand DNA, whether it's crystalline or carbon, aligns with a 12th dimensional universal field. And in order to limit your consciousness or suppress your consciousness, keeping you in the third dimension, the junk DNA has been a program that has been running here on planet Earth for a very long time. But we do want to consider what would be available to you in that carbon DNA. And yes, of course, the ability to live to whatever length of time that your soul desired is possible. But it is not because you wish it that is the important consideration. So if we have 12th dimensional access in a carbon-based DNA to upgrade our physical material, the level of efficiency within which that material manifests is going to continue to improve. That means detoxification, for example, cellular rejuvenation, for example, or even the ability of the physical body to do things at a certain age that it is perceived it could never do. So this is what the junk DNA holds for you. And in addition to a great deal of access beyond the linear mind, because remember, when you're using the brain as an agent of understanding, it is not just what you learn in the physical plane that is of most importance, but the ability to retrieve from beyond the physical plane to accentuate and validate even what you are learning here. So much of what you've been taught in human life has been a program that's limited you to a slight number of choices. But if that information were to be accompanied by the access of 9th and 12th dimensional information readily available to you at your fingertips on planet Earth, you would make better choices, leaving behind some of the past karma, again, that has been repeating for generations of time. Harmonically, even, we believe that the body can become a more sound vehicle of energy, meaning it can support beyond itself. And many of you understand this as a part of the crystalline DNA. When you're using crystalline energy, you're amplifying your auric field, for example. You're able to share that energy with another. But the physical body is electromagnetic. It has the ability to connect with another and uplift it or exchange information at a very high rate of speed. And all of that lies also within the carbon DNA. So your disconnection as a collective has come at the hands of this understanding of junk DNA and only operating in the 3 carbon strands.
Okay, just so I understand, the carbon DNA has these different characteristics available. And so how do we in our present state access them? Is that through the access of the crystalline DNA? Is that what is the key to unlock that potential?
Not necessarily. So the crystalline DNA, it is more a meditative process of activation. And we want to remind you that the crystalline DNA is sentient and it is connected beyond the earth, meaning even though all 12 dimensions exist within the genome, you are able to pull in cosmic energy and information and make use of it on a physical plane. So think of the carbon suite of DNA strands as more focused on your earthly physical presentation and manifestation, where the crystalline DNA is more a focus of hybridization, bringing your cosmic abilities and gifts to interface here in a purposeful and meaningful way. But truly, for you to be able to access the information of the carbon DNA, it isn't so much requesting to find what is within it, but ridding yourself of all the things that stand in the way of its access. Many of you are already aware that heavy metals, toxins, for example, clog up your physical system and create disease. But these things also create a thick field that holds you in a lower dimension. It is a density, in other words, that does not allow access to these other carbon strands. So the more that a soul is purifying and detoxifying in a material, physical way, the more the carbon DNA is going to illuminate and come back online, which means miraculous things are going to change in the physical body. We even believe that at the very core of each cell is a spectrum or a spiral of light that has been disengaged or illuminated for a disengaged or de-illuminated for a very long period of time. In the activation of that carbon DNA, what you'll find is the spectrum of light that a cell can hold becomes amplified. And when that happens, your lifestyle will completely change. You will find yourself in complete agreement with what the cells need and orchestrating a life that is necessary to go to the next level of that DNA activation. So I think it's far easier than what you believe or what you have been told, at least in the physical sense. It truly relates to what you choose to put within the body and what you become as a physical being, where the meditative practices and astral projections are the things that are illuminating the crystalline strands.
Thank you. And thank you, Micheila. All right, we're going to wrap it up there for today, and we'll continue next time on the next Channel Revelation show. We are also on many podcast platforms as well as YouTube, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. And you can find us on Rumble and other video platforms also. So we'll see you next week for another Awaken Empowered podcast.